Lovers, Friends, and Enemies, the Astrology of Congressman Matt Gaetz and his good buddy Joel Greenberg. This segment series is specifically about Joel Greenberg, the man who opened this can of worms and threw not only Matt Gaetz under the bus, but probably a whole lot of other politicians in the process. Alrighty, so just a quick recap for those of you who don't know. Cough, cough, cough. Joel Greenberg is a tax collector in Florida, and apparently being a tax collector is an elected position, not something that you apply for or earn by merit. At this time, Joel Greenberg is facing 33 counts of federal charges, which include the sex trafficking of minors. Apparently, Joel Greenberg is guilty of everything from making fake IDs to identity theft of people who are turning in their IDs to his office to get Florida identifications instead. Now that they had moved there, he was actually taking their identification and doing whatever it is that you do to turn them into using other people's photos with their personal information from those licenses. Literally something right out of high school, as well as the possibility of some election fraud and misappropriation of funds and, yada, yada, yada. And of course, the obvious big scandal right now, which is trying to be a big old PIMP, pimp baby pimp, with the Congress members and other local politicians, which is where Matt Gaetz comes in. So to the left is Mr. Joel Greenberg's chart, and he's quite the interesting character. We're going to take a closer look at him. And the bottom is the headline from one of the papers about Mr. Joel Greenberg. And to the left, sadly enough, so with all of the monkeying around this guy was doing, chasing teenagers with Matt and, barely legal age prostitutes, the picture you're seeing below is his wife and his child. Yeah, just goes to show that it doesn't matter how pretty or thin you are, if your husband is going to do these things, he's going to do these things, and there's nothing you could have done to keep him home, behaving himself, and keeping his wang in his pants. So there you go, ladies. Life lesson. Don't worry about how well you are taking care of yourself, and be more concerned with the character of the man that you are marrying. Okay, so this is Joel Greenberg. He was born February 4th, 1984 in Altamont Springs, Florida. Again, we have an unknown birth time, so there are no houses that we can put these planets in. We're just looking at planetary aspects. Now, his official job is an elected state office holder as the tax collector for Seminole County, Florida. At the time of this recording for this series, it was April 12th, 2021. Okay, now, all right, so Joel is an Aquarius with the moon in Pisces. His Mercury is at 23 Capricorn. His Venus is also in Capricorn. His Mars, ooh, look at this. His Mars is right here, conjunct Saturn in Scorpio, and we're going to talk about that in some detail. His Jupiter is conjunct Neptune at 3 degrees Capricorn. Neptune is at 0 Capricorn. And the final leg of this data dump is going to be Uranus in the South Node conjunct, and Pluto here at 2 Scorpio. So what can we tell about Joel by looking at his chart? So the first thing we're going to look at are the major hard aspects. We've got the Sun in Aquarius. So we have the Sun in Aquarius squaring Mars, Saturn conjunct in Scorpio. This in and of itself is not, it's not a happy position. So Saturn, anytime Saturn involved with personal planets, it always presents its own challenges. And in this particular case, Saturn is with the Sun and Mars, which makes it doubly complicated and potentially toxic, depending on how evolved or emotionally together the person is as they mature into adulthood. So, with a Sun square Mars Saturn conjunction, right? And so just ignore that. Right here is what we're looking at. One of the things that we're going to see as a potential in this person is the ability to be exceptionally cruel because they are detached and removed from things. There's not a lot of emotional investment in things, and when there is, it's typically about power and control. Mars Saturn together in and of itself always gives you somebody who has a deep-seated need for control or power in situations, typically coming from experiences where they have been on the receiving end of other people's abuse, right? So in this lifetime and their experiences, one of the things that they learn very early on in their life is that power and control is the best form of protection for them based on their experiences. Now, on the upside, you can also get somebody who is extremely disciplined and extremely loyal and extremely protective and all of the positive things you could absolutely hope for in a warrior. But that takes a tremendous amount of self-discipline, integrity, character, and development, meaning the person has to have actively worked on themselves to achieve that higher level of ethical display in their behavior. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't necessarily achieve that status of character development in their life, but it is certainly something they can work towards. For people who are choosing to not even work towards such lofty ambitions and goals as being an exemplary person, which is clearly the case here with Mr. Greenberg, their ability to sink to the furthest possible depths are beyond description. So whatever we are hearing about with Mr. Greenberg is literally the tip of the iceberg compared to things he's probably done that we don't know about, given his propensity and ability to sink as high or as low as humanly possible with that particular configuration. That sun squaring it is going to make his identity absolutely invested in being the man in control. So he is always going to want to be the big pimp meister, right? The game master, the person who's, you know, behind the scenes force sort of stuff. And there's always going to be a, a a sympathetic affinity or a fascination or a draw to antisocial activities. Now, antisocial activities typically mean criminal activities, but what's considered a crime also depends on where you are and what period of time you're living in. So, to be very, very clear, it's not about things, he's not attracted to things that are criminal as much as he is attracted to things that are particularly antisocial. And antisocial almost always means criminal. So there's a slight difference, but it's an important distinction. And the reason I say that is the sun is in Aquarius and Mars and Saturn are together in Scorpio, giving not only an emotional removal from situations, meaning he doesn't necessarily feel any personal obligation to the well-being of others with this particular combination. Also, the ability to rationalize this in his mind and have like more of an attachment to the big picture than the reality in front of him is also a possibility. And again, with Mars and Saturn together and square to this Aquarius energy, you get somebody who's perfectly capable of rationalizing just about anything if they really, really wanted to, and convincing themselves of the rightness of their wrongness. And the other thing which reminds me with this particular combination, as far as they're concerned, they're never wrong about anything. They're literally like Wile E. Coyote. They've always got a genius master plan that they're working on that's infallible. So yeah, this is coming out of the gate. This is who this character is before he ever got elected into this office where he was, you know, given public trust with things. So there is that. All right. Now, the other things that we're looking at with this chart is, let's move over to Venus and Capricorn. So let's talk about the Saturn stuff, right? So Venus and Capricorn, right there, is not a happy position. Venus and Capricorn is more of a mercenary placement. We only notice it more in women, mostly because there's usually such an active distrust of women to begin with, that women who are very business oriented and agenda driven in their relationships are seen as terrifying for men and mothers, right? Because nobody wants I don't want my baby son to be used by that horrible, evil woman. And listen, this isn't to say that it doesn't happen the other way around, but for whatever reason, we live at a time and a place where somehow it's easier for us to overlook the abuses and uses of women by men in the most tragic forms, right? And just the most tragic and abuses than we are capable of imagining or accepting that our sons might be exploited by a woman who's got an agenda, right? Somehow that's more alarming than the things we see happening around us all the time. So that's why I'm saying with Venus and Capricorn, we typically tend to see this as more of a problem in a woman's chart than a man's, because in both genders, it lends itself to a very mercenary quality when it comes to relationships. So there's always an agenda, there's always a purpose, there's always a point. But with men, we don't notice it as much because we excuse much worse behavior in men. So, a man having, expectations and an agenda where his relationships with his partners are concerned seems perfectly reasonable compared to everything else. However, a woman having a very specific outline of what she's requiring and expecting and what the trade-offs are, the whole quid pro quo kind of approach really sets off the alarm bells and people notice. And that's what you get with Venus and Capricorn. So, now, with this case, remember that Sun, Mars, Saturn square is just a very toxic, ugly position and requires a lot of work in this lifetime to get out of the potential morass of amorality or immorality that it is predisposed to, the antisocial stuff it has predisposition to in its search for control and power in situations around it. Add Venus in Capricorn to that mix, and what you have is somebody who is very, very capable of presenting in socially acceptable ways, because Venus in Capricorn is very much about the appearances, right? Looking the part, and then proceeding to be all sorts of heinous, evil, and ugly, in behind closed doors. So Joel Greenberg, thank God, did not turn out to be a serial killer, although there's a lot of similarities in the way the operations go for both of them. And in that way, like serial killers, Joel Greenberg has mastered the ability, or has the ability to master the manner of presenting as a perfectly respectable human being. Oh, nope, nothing to see here. Move along, move along. Nice manicured lawn and, perfect wife with the perfect kids and a perfect job. And then underneath that, behind closed doors, unbeknownst to even the people who live with him, hides a monster who goes out and, runs over puppies with lawnmowers or whatever, right? Or in this case, whatever added up to 33 federal counts of criminal charges. Oh boy. So he's got the Mercury in Capricorn. Mercury in Capricorn is a very organized, thorough business sign. Mercury in Capricorn also tends to give him more of an opportunistic kind of way of thinking. So there is that. There's not a lot to say with his Mercury here, at least not right off the top of my head. The only thing I would say about his Mercury in Capricorn is it lends himself to a very organized A to B to C step-by-step approach to thinking, and also a constant eye for how he can leverage himself up into the next best position. But other than that, this particular chart and his Mercury, or rather his Mercury in his chart does not lend itself to any particular criminal genius or any genius of any measure at all. So it's a pretty average intelligence that is only handicapped by the need and habit to have things very organized and moving in a very straight line. So he doesn't do a lot of out-of-the-box thinking, which is good because you know what to predict with him if you know him, but it's bad because you know what to predict with him and about him, especially if you're law enforcement looking to, indict this guy with 33 federal charges. Okay. All right. Now, the other thing, and this is a bit of a generational thing, right? So he's got this Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn. And Jupiter-Neptune conjunction Capricorn lends itself to a bit of, well, pie in the sky ambitions. So the ambitions are generally a lot bigger than the reality will allow them to achieve. Now, what would be more important and easier in this particular case, because these are generational planets, is if we had houses to actually assign this to, because Jupiter and Neptune are not really making a lot of aspects separate from themselves, right? So they do make, get rid of this. So they are making some pleasant aspects down here to Pluto, which again is another generational planet. And depending on where the moon is, because we don't know what time he was born, it may or may not be involving the moon. So we don't have a lot to work with in terms of planetary aspects to tell us about what this Jupiter-Neptune's doing in his chart, in his life, in his personality. Oops, sorry. But what we do know is that Jupiter and Neptune in Capricorn represents ambitious dreams. So he has big, big, ambitious dreams that are not necessarily rooted in reality or what can be realistically achieved in this lifetime. And given, and here's something I want you guys to consider, right? Given what we know about his socializing with Matt Gaetz and Roger Stone, who had a live-in companion or was sharing a residence with a former, air quotes, former madam or female pimp up in New York. And given the charges leveled against him and now Matt Gaetz and all this stuff, especially with the barely legal and underage girls, and the Bahamas trip and all sorts of other stuff that just literally they dig into this box and the box just gets deeper and deeper and more messy. It is not unthinkable that now even more so to imagine that Joel Greenberg had visions and fantasies of being the next Jeffrey Epstein, right? And making all this money servicing, very high income, high profile clientele that absolutely need to have their activities with, inappropriate partners kept under wraps. So this ambition, this very, very almost otherworldly ambition that's far in excess of what's realistically possible, especially with that mercenary Venus in Capricorn and this antisocial Sun, Mars, Saturn square in Scorpio, all this combined with him absolutely makes me suspect that this may have been some of the nature of his involvement with Roger Stone and Matt Gaetz, and this may have been part of the direction he was heading in. Now, but again, this is all speculation because we're not in his head, so we'll see. We'll see. Now, the other thing I'll draw your attention to, I thought this was interesting, is the Uranus South Node conjunction. And again, Uranus is an outer planet, so we have to look at it in combination with other things, which in this case, depending on what time he was born, would be the moon. So Uranus conjunct the South Node is always, your South Node is always going to give you the things that are easy for you. So a lot of people will say that you should stay out of your South Node and only do your North Node and yada, 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 yada. And your South Node's your karma. Oy. Okay, so here's, and this is my position. You can certainly adopt whatever position feels good to you and serves your purposes. But here's the thing with your nodes. You can't excise one node and keep the other. Like they're both there and they are both very operative in your life. The South Node theoretically represents your past lives and where you're coming from, right? It also represents the things that you are good at and the things that come easy to you because you have, quote unquote, been there, done that. So the reason we want to try instead of our South Node is because we have, air quotes, been there, done that, and we don't need to repeat it again. You're here to learn the lessons and activities that are represented by your North Node. But it's very easy, like a bad habit, it's very easy to fall back into our South Node and retard our own progress and growth. Joel Greenberg has Uranus conjuncting his South Node in Sagittarius. So this would imply that in his previous lifetime, and the things that he easily slides back into are antisocial behaviors, Uranus, this whole acting like he is his own authority, and it's the Wild West and, he can do what he wants kind of thing, because Uranus represents the outliers, the people who they're not deliberately against society, they're just nonconformists, right? So they are playing by their own rules, among the many things that Uranus represents. So, and it's in Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is, again, somebody else who has their own, they kind of make the rules up as they go along. They have a huge respect for the rules, but often they have more respect for their own rules. And also, too, with the South Node in Sagittarius, there's always this wildness or lack of civilization and social courtesies and social graces that's represented by Gemini that Sagittarius does not have. So Sagittarius represents the wild man living in the woods, you know, away from society kind of thing in the most natural setting possible. So he doesn't need to adopt, you know, civilized behaviors because he doesn't live in civilization with the rest of us. That's the South Node of Sagittarius. So anybody with South Node, North Node, Gemini Sag, emphasis, especially if you have South Node in Sagittarius, one of the things that's very easy to slide back into that you have to guard against because you're trying to do the exact opposite is forgetting that you live in civilization and you have to play by the rules of civilization, which include social graces and all of those things that you would normally consider hypocritical because it's not the truth, right? Sagittarius, the truth. Sometimes you got to tell a little white lie, you know, to get along in the world. So, you know, tell the hostess their dinner was fantastic, even though it was awful. You know, no, yeah, that dress looks great. Hairstyle looks awesome. Sometimes it's the little lies that we tell that kind of keep things smoothly running between people so that life can continue, that matter more than the brazen, unvarnished honesty and truth of something, or at least as we see it. With Uranus there in Sagittarius as well, with that South Node, and exact, oh dear God, exact. In this particular instance with him, antisocial outlier behavior, where he is literally a law unto himself, is absolutely something he could easily slide back into, and also a bit of the anti-government, anti-Big Brother, anything that allows him to be a wild man out fending for himself, you know, in outside of the perimeters of civilization as he sees it, are things that he could easily find himself adopting over and over and over again to his detriment because he's not supposed to do that anymore. He's supposed to do his North Node in Gemini. Now, with the moon in Pisces squaring that, and how tight or wide that square is depends on what time he was born. But basically that moon is pretty much really close to that square, so I would absolutely use it. With a moon Uranus square, regardless of sign, one of the things you're going to have is somebody who they have difficulty concentrating. So there's a little bit of this ADD, ADHD kind of short circuit in the thinking that goes on. So one of the challenges I would think with Mr. Greenberg is that he has a hard time staying focused on things. Lots of nervous energy and a lot of starts and stops and fits in life, right? And he's also prone to fits. With the moon in Pisces squaring this Uranus South Node conjunction, one of the other things with that particular specific combination is the ability to live in a fantasy land of his own making. And that also is obviously problematic for the obvious reasons, but also it's part of his South Node past life stuff. He's coming from a lifetime where he didn't have to pay attention to what was going on around him. He was perfectly capable and content and able to live in his own little world or fantasy island of his own making. And that ability to be lost in your own fantasies about what's really going on in life or what's happening is very strong in this lifetime. And it's something that has to be guarded against. Because remember, the other side of that node is the North Node in Gemini. So that moon in Pisces scoring the North Node in Gemini also means that in this lifetime he's been given, whether he chooses to use it or not, he has been given the opportunity to be a voice or an agent of change for people who are unable to speak for themselves. And you would think going into a political office that it's just understood that that is what your job is supposed to be. But apparently he did not see things that way. So his whole trip, you know, has been about, you know, money, power, influence, and control for himself. How, you know, literally using this to benefit himself and not to speak or act as an agent for other people. And that's very sad. Now, we could say that his Chiron in Taurus loaned itself to this problem, because Chiron in Taurus represents our values in this lifetime, right? And also some issues with our personal values as it meets the world around us. So we could easily have somebody who is very security conscious and very money driven to the point of being money grubbing, or it could be somebody who is constantly struggling with financial issues. It's never quite getting on top of their finances, no matter how uh, how much support, assistance, or lucky breaks they do get, right? They manage to lose, squander, or, through sheer mishap and circumstance, lose their foothold in terms of financial security. Or you could have somebody who works through their Chiron issues and knows how to make do with limited resources and maximize the use of whatever limited resources they have available and turn everything into a building block for more growth and gain later. So we could say that the Chiron and Taurus and values and resources, as they present as problems for him, may have contributed to all of this mess that we're seeing that is the rest of his chart, as he has chosen to live it out at this time. But we could also just say that this is what he has chosen for himself to live out at this time. So this is Mr. Matt Gaetz, and he has clearly taken his chart, and rather than do the hard work on himself, has decided to take the easy way out and slid right into all of the unsavory and ugly behaviors that are very real possibilities with his particular setup. And that is unfortunate. So, and this is Mr. Matt Gaetz' Party Buddy. And that is the very, very brief and quick overview of Mr. Joel Greenberg. So we will now move into the relationship examination between these two characters in the next segment. I hope you enjoyed this. Remember to hit the subscribe and notification bell if you'd like to get notified when the next videos come up. And if you enjoyed this, by all means, please like and maybe even share it with somebody you think might enjoy it too.